Hello again for another Monday Night Live reading with Mr. S. Tonight we're going to be reading from Ian Mortimer's fantastic book, The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, subtitled, of course, A Handbook for Visitors to the 14th Century. This is a book that Rachel Garner recommended to me a few years ago, and I thought it was terrific. Mortimer's done some other books along this line, but I really like this one. It's got some reviews on the back, some quotes from reviews that say things like, "It is Monty Python and the Holy Grail with footnotes, and my goodness, it is fun." Or, "After the Canterbury Tales, this has to be the most entertaining book ever written about the Middle Ages." And the resulting portrait of the era is as lively as it is informative. His work of speculative social history is eminently entertaining, but this doesn't detract from the serious and thorough research involved. So I don't do a lot of nonfiction stuff, and I don't do a lot of history. That's not really my area. I mean, I do like to read history, usually World War II, that kind of thing, sometimes Civil War era, American Civil War. And once in a while, I'll just delve into something that didn't know anything about. For a few years, it was the late 19th century American journalism. I've also read a few things about the Soviet Union, etc. So this is a little different for me. Other than like looking up diagrams of castles and things when I'm researching a particular era or place. This book is a great place to start. If you really want to know more about medieval England, the Middle Ages, than what you can learn from watching Hollywood movies or fantasy, like adaptations of things. One thing that I assume that lots of people would agree with me on about this is that Hollywood doesn't really care that much whether they get facts right or not. And they tend to make one of two mistakes frequently. One is that they just don't care that they have anachronistic stuff where they have, knights saying things like "okay," or whatever the phrase is. They don't really care that much if knights are wearing armor that's like made out of chrome. If you've ever seen First Knight, you know what I'm talking about. Just because they're looking for a cool visual effect, and so history doesn't really matter, because to them, it probably makes sense in some ways. Yeah, we're going to make it look as cool as possible because that's what people care about. They don't care about history. The thing that's worse to me than that is when they make people inhuman because they know we're stupid enough that we think people in the past weren't really human. And the reason I bring that up is because what he does so well in this book, I'm not going to read the introduction, but he talks about how if you want to know the people, or if you want to know what an era was like, you just have to look at it through the eyes of the people. And so he basically says in the introduction that if you think of history as happening right now, a historic period, and you think, what is it going to be like when I get there? And you imagine you're going to have to people it with people. And that will help you to connect with them, even though they may believe things that you just find really hard to understand. And they may do things that make no sense to you. Once you connect with them as people, then you will be able to get insight into why they think and behave the way they do. So I'm not going to read the introduction, but that's kind of his beginning. That's why he says we're going to call it The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England. It's a travelogue, as if we could go back in time and experience things. So I'm going to read a couple of different excerpts. I'm not going to just start. I am going to start with chapter 1, not with the introduction. And then I'm going to skip and read a couple other things, just because I'll give you a flavor for what this book is like. So chapter 1 is called The Landscape. It is the cathedral that you will see first. As you journey along the road, you come to a break in the trees, and there it is, massive and magnificent, cresting the hilltop in the morning sun. Despite the wooden scaffolding at its west end, the long 80-foot-high pointed lead roof and the flying buttresses and colossal towers is simply the wonder of the region. It is hundreds of times bigger than every other building around it and dwarfs the stone walls surrounding the city. The hundreds of houses appear tiny, all at chaotic angles and of different shades and hues, as if they were so many stones at the bottom of a stream flowing around the great boulder of the cathedral. The 30 churches, though their low, stumpy towers stand out from the massive roofs, seem humble by comparison. When you draw closer to the city walls, you will see the great gatehouse. 2 round towers, each more than 50 feet high, stand either side of a pointed arch, newly built, with a painted statue of the king in a niche above the grand entrance. It leaves you in no doubt about the civic pride of the city, nor its authority. Beyond these gates, you are subject to the mayor's jurisdiction. Here reside the king's officers in the castle on the northeastern perimeter. Here is a place of rule and order. The high circling walls, the statue of the king, the great round towers, and above it all, the immense cathedral collectively impress you with their sheer strength. And then you notice the smell. 400 yards from the city gate, the muddy road you are following crosses a brook. As you look along the banks, you see piles of refuse, broken crockery, animal bones, entrails, human feces, and rotting meat strewn in and around the bushes. In some places, the muddy banks slide into thick quagmires where the townsmen have hauled out their refuse and pitched it into the stream. In others, rich green grasses, reeds, and undergrowth spring from the highly fertilized earth. As you watch, 2 semi-naked men lift another barrel of excrement from the back of a cart and empty it into the water. A small brown pig roots around in the garbage. You have come face to face with the contrasts of a medieval city. It is so proud, so grand, and in places so beautiful, and yet it displays all the disgusting features of a bloated glutton. The city as a body is a caricature of the human body, smelly, dirty, commanding, rich, and indulgent. As you hurry across the wooden bridge, over the brook, and hasten towards the gates, the contrasts become even more vivid. A couple of boys with dirty faces and tousled hair run towards you and crowd around, shouting, "Sir, do you want a room? A bed for the night? Where are you from?" Struggling between them to take the reins of your horse, and maybe pretending that they know your brother or are from the same region as you. Their clothes are filthy and their feet even filthier, bound into leather shoes which have suffered the stones and mud of the streets for more years than their owners. Welcome to a place of pride, wealth, authority, crime, justice, high art, stench, and beggary. The city described above is Exeter in the southwest of England, but it could almost be any of the 17 cathedral cities. You could say the same for many of the large towns, too, except for the fact that their churches are not cathedrals. Arriving in every one of these places involves an assault on all the senses. Your eyes will open wide at the great churches, and you will be dazzled by the wealth and the stained glass they contain. Your nostrils will be invaded by the stench from the sewage-polluted watercourses and town ditches. After the natural quiet of the country road, the birdsong, and the wind in the trees, your hearing must attune to the calls of travelers and town criers, the shouts of laborers, and the ringing of church bells. In any town on a market day or during a fair, you will find yourself being jostled by the crowds who come in from the country for the occasion and who live it up rowdily in the taverns. To visit an English town in the late 14th century is a bewildering and extremely sensory experience. A major town is an intimidating place. Already you will have seen the desiccated remains of thieves left hanging on gallows at windswept crossroads. At the principal gates of a regional capital, you will find the heads and limbs of traitors on display. When you enter the city of York, the largest city in the north, you will see the blackened heads of criminals stuck on poles above the city gates, their eyes plucked out by birds. Legs and arms hang by ropes, each the relic of a treasonable plot, now riddled with maggots or covered with flies. These remains remind you of the power of the king, a greater and more ominous shadow behind the immediate authority of the mayor and aldermen, local lords, sheriffs, and judicial courts. This, you could say, is the landscape of medieval England, a place of fear and decay. But the moment you walk under the shadow of a city gatehouse, you realize it is much more than that. In Exeter, for example, as soon as you enter the great gate of the city, you face the wide and handsome prospect of South Street. Some of the finest houses and inns are here, the gable ends of their steeply angled roofs neatly meeting the street. On your right is the Church of Holy Trinity, a cult of special devotion in the late 14th century. Farther down, you have the handsome townhouse of an abbot. On your left is a row of merchants' houses, some with their shops open, with silks and other expensive fabrics on show inside the covered shop fronts. For a moment, you might notice the uneven surface of the road, which is dust, or mud after it has rained. But then you will be distracted by the amount of activity around you. Ponies and pack horses are ambling through the town towards the marketplace, laden with grain and guided by peasants from the local farms. Priests pass by robed in their habits, with crucifixes and rosaries hanging from their girdles. Perhaps a black-robed Dominican friar is preaching to the people at the top of the street, watched by a small circle of admirers. Workers are driving their sheep and cattle into market or steering carts laden with eggs, milk, and cheeses toward the line of shops known as Milk Street. The city is so alive, so full of busy people, that within a short while you have forgotten about the decapitated traders. And the brook stench is no longer in the air. Now there is a remarkable absence of animal dung in the streets. All is revealed in South Street when you see a servant shoveling up horse dung from the area in front of his master's house. As you walk towards the center of the city, you will encounter more traders' shops tightly packed together in small street-front premises, sometimes tiny rooms of less than 40 square feet, but all with their distinctive projecting signs to tell the illiterate their trade. Some are paintings depicting the items on sale, such as a painted knife indicating the shop of a cutler. Others are three-dimensional objects, a bushel on a pole showing that freshly brewed ale is available, or a bandaged arm marking a surgeon's premises. At the top of Smithen Street, which leads down to the river, you can hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, hammering away at their forges and shouting in guttural voices at their apprentices to fetch water or bring coal. Others in the same street are setting up stalls, hanging out ironwares such as scissors, rushlight holders, and knives to attract the attention of those coming in from the surrounding countryside. A little farther on you come to Butcher's Row, or the Shambles, where the counters of the shops are laden with meat lying exposed in the sun, with joints and carcasses hanging from hooks in the shade of the shop behind. Listen to the thunk as the cleaver comes down and strikes the chopping board, and watch as the leather-aproned butcher lifts the red meat onto the scales, balancing it carefully with metal weights until he is satisfied that he, at least, is getting a good deal. It is here, among the city shops, that your preconceptions of medieval England will begin to fall apart. Walk into the center of any large town or city, and you will be struck by the extraordinary range of costumes, from russet-clad peasants to richly dressed merchants and esquires and their wives, and maybe even a knight or nobleman. Their traveling cloaks might hide the colorful hues of their clothes in gray winter, but in this sunlight the rich reds, bright yellows, and deep blues are shown off, trimmed with furs according to social rank. Similarly, the languages and accents you hear in a city give a cosmopolitan air to the place. Foreign merchants are regularly to be found in the greater towns and cities, but even in the smaller ones you will hear both French and English spoken in the street, and occasionally Latin and Cornish. Over the hubbub of the morning's business, you will hear the town crier calling from the crossroads at the center of the town, or laughter as friends share a joke. Over it all, the practiced cries of the street vendors ring out as they walk around with trays of food, calling out, "Hot peascods," or "Rushes fair and green," "Hot sheep's feet," or "Ribs of beef and many a pie." Given the noise and the textures of the place, you may be surprised to learn how few people actually live in the greater towns and cities of England. In 1377, the walls of Exeter encircle 600 or 700 houses where about 2,600 citizens live. But that makes it the 24th largest community in the whole kingdom. Only the very largest, London, with more than 40,000 inhabitants, can properly be called a great city when compared to the largest continental cities of Bruges, Ghent, Paris, Venice, Florence, and Rome, all of which have in excess of 50,000. However, do not be misled into thinking that towns like Exeter are small, quiet places. The inns add considerably to the total, albeit on a continually shifting basis. Travelers of all sorts, clergymen, merchants, messengers, king's officers, judges, clerks, master masons, carpenters, painters, pilgrims, itinerant preachers, and musicians are to be found every day in a town. In addition, you will come across crowds of local people coming in from the countryside to buy goods and services or to bring their produce to the retailers. When you think of the sheer variety of wares and services which the city provides, from metalwork to leatherwork, from the sheriff's courts and scriveners' offices to apothecaries and spicemongers' shops, it soon becomes clear how the daytime population of a city can be 2 or even 3 times as great as the number of people living within the walls. And, on a special occasion, During a fair, for example, it can be many times greater. The total of 100,000 taxpayers in the 30 largest communities indicates that about 170,000 people, about 6 or 7% of the population of the kingdom, live in towns. There are about 200 other market towns in England with more than 400 inhabitants. In total, about 12% of English people live in a town of some sort, even if it be a small town of just 100 families. It follows that the majority live in rural areas, coming into their local town or city when necessary. The majority walk in and walk home, carrying whatever they have bought or driving whatever livestock they have to sell. It is this purposeful coming and going of people, this movement, which makes a medieval city feel so vibrant and alive. The range of people living in a city is matched by the wide variety of buildings to be found within the walls. You've already seen some of the most handsome and prestigious houses, situated on the widest, grandest, and cleanest streets, which are almost always those leading from the principal gates into the center of town. But not all citizens dwell in the luxury of handsome 3-story houses. You will have noticed the small alleys, sometimes no more than 6 or 7 feet wide. They look dark on account of the jetties of upper stories which close in over the thoroughfare so that the second and third stories of houses facing each other come within just 3 or 4 feet. Houses here have little light and probably no outside space. Some alleys are barely more substantial than muddy paths. If there are no servants to clear them, and if the householders fail to clean them, before long they become dank, smelly, and altogether unsavory. Walk along one of them in winter on a murky afternoon in the rain, and your impression of richness and civic pride will soon be washed away. The rain splashes down into wide, muddy puddles through which you will have to pass, and the lack of light, due to the lowering clouds and the overarching houses, rinses all color from the scene. Then you see the rivulets of water trickling between the buckets of offal and kitchen rubbish outside a house, carrying the liquid of rotting food into the street. Next time you walk along here in the churned-up mud, the stench of decay will fill your nostrils. These 2- and 3-story buildings are nowhere near the bottom end of the housing hierarchy. If you walk down a few more of these dark alleys, you will see that there are turnings off which are even narrower. The most densely inhabited areas of a city are warrens of tiny lanes and paths, sometimes no more than 3 or 4 feet wide. Here you find the poorest houses, low, single-story rows of old timber buildings with no proper foundations, subdivided into small rented rooms. You can see that they are old. The shutters hang at angles or have disappeared completely. The shingles, wooden tiles, are slipping from the roofs, which are covered in lichen and moss or streaked with birdlime. The paths and alleys leading to them are little more than stinking drains, effectively open sewers. They are the most dilapidated buildings in the city, but because they are not on a main street, and because they do not threaten civic pride, because no visitors or wealthy people see them, the authorities do not force the owners to keep them in good repair. If a door is open, you may just discern in the gloom a single room divided into 2 unequal parts, the smaller for the children to sleep in and the other for cooking and the adults' mattresses. There's often no toilet, just a bucket, to be emptied in the brook. The tenants of these houses spend almost the whole day away from home at their workplaces. They eat in the street and urinate and defecate where they can, ideally in the municipal toilets on the city bridge. Their children grow up similarly out of doors, playing in the street. They were the urchins who ran up to you when you first approached the city gate. Walking through the alleys and lanes of a medieval city, you are bound to come face to face with a high wall. This is not the great wall encircling the settlement, but one of a number of subdivisions you can expect to find. Around monasteries, for example, or protecting the houses of rich knights, prelates, and lords. In most cities you will find the precincts of the cathedral area enclosed by a wall, with gates allowing people in during daylight hours and firmly keeping them out after dark. Similarly, the older monasteries, which may date back to Saxon times, tend to be located in the center of the city. All towns have at least one walled-off religious enclosure, and some have more than a dozen. For this reason, space inside even the most extensive city is relatively scarce. Often a third of the whole area inside the walls is given over to the monasteries and religious precincts. Add the tenth or so given over to the royal castle, and a similar area for the parish churches, and it is clear that almost the entire population has to live in half the city, with most of the best sites occupied by the large houses of the wealthy. Hence, the immigrant population has to be squeezed into small tenements constructed on the sites of destroyed houses or alongside a churchyard. Few inhabitants of these slums make enough money to move up into the houses of the prosperous traders and freemen of the town. Walk back to the market square or the main market street of the city and look around. Notice how almost all the houses are narrow and tall. Each is no more than about 15 or 16 feet wide. Most are 3 or 4 stories in height, with shutters either side of the unglazed windows. This arrangement of narrow, tall houses means that many merchants can have a frontage on the main marketplace. At ground level, you see the heavy oak door to the building. To its side, and occupying most of the front of the house, is the shop front. At night and on Sundays, this is closed up and looks like a wooden barricade across a large window. But during trading hours, the lower half is hinged down to form a display counter, and the upper half is hinged up and propped to provide a shelter for the goods. The shop inside may actually be a workshop, perhaps of a leatherworker, jeweler, tailor, shoemaker, or similar craftsman. Other traders, butchers and fishmongers, for instance, tend to work out of doors, standing in front of their counters, using their shop's interiors as storage areas. In either case, the house above is where the trader and his family live. Only the richest merchants, those who specialize in goods transported in bulk by sea, have separate houses and warehouses. This close relationship of residence and work means that many shop buildings have some fine touches of decoration, tiled or slate-hung upper stories, or projecting wooden beams with carved corner pieces. Some even boast carved and painted coats of arms or heraldic beasts. And then you turn a corner and see some totally different houses, altogether larger and set sideways onto the street. Your eye is immediately drawn to the pointed gatehouse, with a crenellated stone tower above, or the long wooden house with large oriel windows projecting over the road. These are the houses of the wealthiest and most important citizens. Just as the various types of traders congregate together, the dyers by a watercourse, the cloth merchants in Cloth Street, the butchers in Butchers' Row, the majority of the most influential citizens also live close to one another in the widest, most prominent streets. Here you may find the town house of a major financier next to that of a knight or an archdeacon. At the start of the century, such houses may well be still made of wood, but increasingly they are being rebuilt, so that by 1400 the majority are proud and sturdy stone structures with chimneys and glazed windows. This is why, when gazing down a street of well-spaced, high-status town mansions, you will invariably see 1 or 2 covered in scaffolding. Close inspection will reveal that the scaffolding is made up of poles of alder and ash lashed together, supporting planks of poplar with pulleys for raising and maneuvering stones and baskets of tiles. In this way, the dilapidated remains of the 13th century are gradually being swept away, and new and extended structures are taking their place. These types of accommodation, from the single-room alleyway slums to the tall merchants' houses and the wide stone mansions of the wealthy, do not fully illustrate the variety in building and accommodation in a city. There are, in addition, the smart houses of the canons and other officers within the cathedral precinct, each with its scriptorium, chapel, and library, as well as living quarters. In the case of Exeter, there is the royal castle with its ancient gatehouse, which is already 300 years old by the time the Black Prince visits it in 1372. There is the Guildhall abutting the High Street, the bishop's palace adjacent to the cathedral, and the College of the Vicars Choral, who sing mass in the cathedral just outside the cathedral close. The finest inns, with their signs displayed above their wide arched gates, are to be found on the main streets. The towers of the town gatehouses also provide accommodation to a select few civic servants. At the bottom end of society, accommodation for some visitors is provided by letting out sleeping space in the barns and stables that are to be found dotted around the city. Many houses are subdivided so that, in a row of 3 old traders' houses, you might find a dozen poor families. There are also the monastic guest houses, the friaries, and the hospitals. And as you leave the city itself and pass into the suburbs, you will have the distinct impression that, while the residents might be relatively few in number, the structures in which they live show greater variety than any modern city, even though the latter has 20 or 30 times as many inhabitants. One last thing. Before you leave, turn around and look back along the main street. Have you noticed that the roads are practically the only public spaces? There are no public parks, no public gardens, and the large open squares are very rare in English cities except where they serve as the marketplace. The street is the sole common outdoor domain. The Guildhall is only for freemen of the city. The parish churches are only for parishioners. When people gather together in large numbers, they meet in the streets, often in the marketplace or at the market cross. It is there that news is disseminated by the town crier. Jugglers perform and friars preach. But the market cross is only the central point in this network of conversations. Gossip is spread by men and women meeting in the lanes and alleys, at the shops, in the market itself, or at the water conduits. It is not just the buildings that make a medieval city, but the spaces between them. All right. Just looking to see how much time I have. Take a quick drink here, and then I'm going to read one more excerpt that I think will give you another kind of a different flavor for how the author gets across the humanity of people in the 14th century. I found this shorter excerpt quite enjoyable. And this is basically, this is from a chapter called What to Eat and Drink. So he goes through different places where you might stay. And so he's got subtitled like Noble Households, because you can stay there, towns and cities. Where would you stay? What if you have to spend the night in a peasant's home? He's got a section on rhythms of food, on how, food is so plentiful today, like you can buy strawberries year round, etc. But in the 14th century, food had a definite rhythm that followed the seasons, and also things like Lent, etc. So what I want to read from you, though, is what to expect if you were to stop at a monastery. The provision of food and drink in a monastic establishment is just as complicated as that in a nobleman's household. Although the monks are all equal in the eyes of God, they are far from equal in their own eyes. The abbot gets the best food and also gets to share the lordly fare provided in his house to the monastery's noble guests, who stay with him in his lodging. Certain monastic officers, such as the almoner, sacrist, infirmarer, and chamberlain, have rights to better fish and more exotic fruit than the other monks. Those monasteries which have lay brothers provide them with their own refectory, kitchen, and diet. Guests staying in the monastic guest house may be given a different diet altogether. On one level, you could describe the monastic household as a lordly one, with the abbot or prior as the lord. That would be superficial for many reasons. First, the man in charge has been elected to his position by the other monks, and so his relationship with his fellows is wholly different to that between a lord and his servant. Also, the monastic refectory is a restricted area. Only monks may eat there. Important guests eat with the abbot in his lodging, less important guests in the guest house or at the beggar's gate. But most of all, it is the extraordinary custom about eating meat which have the extraordinary customs about eating meat which have developed over the centuries which make dining in a monastery unique. Like everyone else, monks do not eat any flesh on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, nor in Advent or Lent. In addition, they are not supposed to eat the meat of four-legged animals at all, according to the rule of St. Benedict. However, St. Benedict lived a long time ago, in the 6th century, and over the subsequent 800 years, monks all over Christendom have found ways to circumvent the rule. Rule is capitalized. These monks mostly come from well-off families, and so were stuffed with the best and richest meats from the day they could sit up at their father's table. Then they entered the church and were completely deprived of meat. The result is that many of them simply crave it, and the rule states only that they should not eat meat in the refectory. Consequently, many monasteries have built a second dining room called the Misericorde, or Place of Mercy, where meat eating can take place. Also, although eating quadrupeds is banned, there is nothing in the rule specifically against eating offal, which is removed from an animal prior to roasting it. Realizing that all this is not wholly within the spirit of the rule, but realizing also that he cannot stand in the way of progress, Benedict XII, Pope from 1334 to 42, suggests a compromise. As long as at least half of the monks eat in the refectory, the remainder can head off to the Misericorde. I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. and gorge themselves on whatever meat they choose, provided it is not a Wednesday, Friday, or Saturday, or a day in Advent or Lent. Those who remain in the refectory must refrain from eating the flesh of quadrupeds, but may eat fowl and can include meaty ingredients, such as liver and other offal, in the cooking. On the non-meat days, everyone must eat together in the refectory and observe the non-meat rules. Each member of a religious community has an allocation of a gallon of ale each day, although the officers are allowed more if they want it. This is no hardship. Monasteries brew very fine ale indeed. When offered for sale, it regularly fetches, I don't know what that designation is, but 1.5 or 2 somethings a day. A few monasteries also have their own vineyards and make their own wine, but the majority import the wines of Gascony, like most large households. Wine is drunk only on saints' days, when the meal is more of a feast. Fortunately for the monks, there are 60 or 70 of these in the year. As with a noble establishment, not everyone in the monastery has breakfast. Only the abbot and the principal officers are likely to be allowed to sit down and eat bread and cheese in the morning. The others must content themselves with Mass, in line with the old saying, "The sacrament is a good breakfast." For most monks, lay brethren, and guests, the first meal of the day is dinner. In the refectory, it starts with a pottage. Thereafter, depending on whether it is a fish day or not, you may be served umbles, sheep entrails cooked in ale with breadcrumbs and spices, often served in winter. Charlotte, chopped meat, eggs, and milk. Dowsit, a custard dish containing milk, cream, eggs, sugar, and currants. Or a rich cheese flan. Somehow the Benedictine monks at Westminster managed to justify eating bacon, even though it is most certainly the meat of a quadruped, and so bacon and eggs, bacon collops as it is called, is served in the refectory as a treat just before Lent. When the Misericord is functioning, the monks display a huge appetite for meat. Pope Benedict's compromise means that a monk may only eat in the Misericord for a maximum of 86 days per year. Hence he looks forward to his turn, especially if it follows a long period of abstinence, such as Lent. The first course at dinner is almost always beef. The second course normally consists of more beef, plus 3 further roasted meats, veal, mutton, pork, or goose. Lamb is eaten in late spring, boiled pork in winter. At other times of the year, mutton is served. At supper, only 1 meat course may be served. Thus most monks eat about 400 meat dishes per year. You might agree that that is hardly following a rule which dictates that he should not eat the flesh of quadrupeds at all. Many species of fish appear in a monastic diet. Every day the refectory sees fried, poached, baked, and roast fish served at dinner. Note that it is only at dinner that monks eat fish. At supper time they eat shellfish, such as cockles and whelks. About half the intake is preserved sea fish, whether salted, smoked, dried, or pickled, but as monasteries often have the tithes of parishes, or are institutional lords or manors in their own right, they can expect to be sent freshwater fish on a regular basis. Some of the largest fish ponds in the country are owned by monasteries. Gracious Pond, Surrey, constructed by the abbot of Chertsey in 1308, extends to over 35 acres, and the ponds at Frensham, also Surrey, extend to over 100 acres. Thus you will often find dace, roach, and bream served in the refectory, or that old favorite pike in galantine sauce. The abbot might eat more expensive seawater fish, turbot, gurnard, thornback ray, sole, conger, eel, and salmon. It depends whether he is eating privately in his quarters with a guest or whether with the brethren in the refectory. One last thing. There's an old traveling minstrel's trick which you might want to keep up your sleeve. How guests are treated in a monastery is the decision of the almoner. If he treats you badly, or serves you the most miserly portions of food, or if you get given, quote, a vile and hard bed, end quote, go to the abbot and praise him to the skies for the generosity of his house, and emphasize the large amount of money which the almoner must have laid out on your behalf. Quote, "My lord, I thank you and your worthy convent for the great cheer I have had here, and of the great cost I have taken of you, for your good liberal monk, your almoner, served me yester evening at my supper worthily, with many divers costly messes of fish, and I drank passing good wine. And now I am going, he has given me a new pair of boots, and a good pair of new knives, and a new belt." End quote. The abbot will have little choice but to take such thanks at face value and bask in the fictitious glory. But have no doubt, the almoner will have a lot of explaining to do later. All right, so a couple of things. I apologize for mispronouncing whatever words I mispronounced, including some of the fish. I live in the middle of America. I don't eat a lot of fish, so I know how to pronounce salmon. I can also pronounce catfish pretty well, because we have that around here, and crappie, which looks like something different. What else? Also, I did leave out one book or one word. I just kind of skipped over in this. I meant to say that beforehand. So hopefully Ian Mortimer will forgive me if he ends up seeing this recording, simply because I wanted this to be a G-rated recording, but it's not terribly offensive. And actually makes sense. It's kind of interesting in context. Referring to the brook, I suppose. So what do I want to say about this? Oh, okay, so I'm going to do another reading in 2 weeks. I will not be able to do one Monday night, but then I actually have, I think, 8 awesome books lined up to do. So I'm really excited about the books we're going to be doing. The one that will be 2 weeks from tonight is A Monster Calls. I'm also going to be doing a reading from The Princess Bride, from a really great book that lots of people will not have heard of. It's a commercial science fiction writer named Harry Harrison wrote a series, the first of which is called The Stainless Steel Rat, and that's fun. I think you'll enjoy that one. Good Books Guide, I often mention. We're taking a little bit of a break. We did the June drawing. We're going to take a break in July and possibly August, and maybe we'll return to it, so don't unsubscribe. And in fact, if you have not subscribed, you should subscribe to that, because we'll return to the free book bundle giveaway things that we're doing. And other than that, hope you enjoyed the Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, and I will see you in a couple weeks. Have a good night.